RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Today's episode is sponsored by Fizz Hydration Tablets, the convenient way to get your hydration needs, vitamins and minerals covered in one easy tablet. To get a discount of 20%, use the code SPORT20 at their checkout. Yes, welcome back to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Today is episode 65. My name's Jamie Bain, and today you're in for a real treat because this is our velocity-based training special where we interview Steve Thompson, PhD in velocity-based training measures from Sheffield Hallam University. Go into all the detail on VBT, what it is, best practices, limitations of it. It really is full of information with a training method that's really sort of coming of age. It's been around for a while, but I think there's more and more going into it. So we hear some of the latest research on it and tons more as well from Steve. So give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Steve, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. It's great to have you on. Let's start by you telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into strength and conditioning and who you've worked with.
Hi Jamie, yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to come on and speak. It's somewhat humbling to be sort of rubbing podcast shoulders with some of the people you've had on the past, so I appreciate the invitation. So my background I'd suggest is relatively bog standard from what you might expect of kind of an academic / S&C coach. I started back in 2006, going on to study sport and exercise science and went straight through into an MSc at Sheffield Hallam University. And I suppose it was my MSc that really filled me with passion about sport and exercise science and strength and conditioning. You know, back then there was no S&C specialist courses, there was no undergrads or postgrads in S&C. So it was very much a generic sport and exercise science course, but I was able to specialise a little bit in S&C, and that's where I really did start to find a passion for it. Following university, I came away, did an internship based in Nottingham with a company called Sport 981, which was excellent and really helped me progress and develop as an S&C coach. And then I suppose my career took a little bit of a turn. I needed a job at the time and applied for a technician role at Hallam. My foothold into academia really. And you know, my role as a technician was really important to me because it really helped me hone my lab and research skills, but provided me with the freedom to carry on coaching and sort of developing myself from an S&C perspective as well. And then, you know, as soon as my sort of tenure as a technician ended, I transitioned across to the academy at Sheffield Hallam and became a lecturer, and have been doing so for 5 or 6 years now. But alongside that, you know, for the sort of the past 10 years, I've been coaching sort of, I suppose, part time, and you know, I've tried my hand in many different sports, sort of golf, rugby, wheelchair fencing, table tennis, boxing, any kind of sport. I've had a little stint at it, which is great for me because it keeps things interesting. It's really helped me develop sort of from a wide perspective. Some really key moments for me from S&C would be being part of the GB women's volleyball support team prior to London 2012, and then currently I'm working as a kind of a co-lead S&C coach for the City of Sheffield Diving, which, you know, the majority of those athletes are part of the GB setup. So I've had the pleasure of being able to coach Commonwealth medalists and Olympic athletes. Currently I'm also an S&C coach for Barnsley Football Club Academy as well, primarily with the 14s and under 14s and under 15 kids. So that kind of brings me to my main role, I suppose, which, as I've mentioned, is lecturer. And I've recently become the lead for for our new MSc in strength and conditioning coaching, which started September just gone at Hallam. And also alongside all this, I'm undertaking a PhD, which it focuses on velocity-based training, which is obviously going to be what we spend most of our time talking about today.
Yeah, well, obviously tons of experience, and it's really nice having that balance of the academic and also the hands-on coaching stuff. So it'd be really interesting to get your point of view on velocity-based training. So let's get straight into it. What is velocity-based training in a nutshell, I guess?
So velocity-based training is it's been around for years and years and years, decades probably. Coaches have been measuring velocity during resistance training for a long time, and it's only really over the past maybe 5-6 years that it's really become kind of this new popularized sexy approach to training. And I think probably the main reason for that is through the developments in technology. So back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, the technology was quite limited, but over the past maybe decade, the developments in technology and the amount of devices that have come on the market have made velocity-based training so much more accessible, and I think that's what's driven the popularity in it sort of over the past few years. And for me, so the name velocity-based training was actually coined by a US S&C coach called Brian Mann a fair few years ago, and it kind of just stuck, this term velocity-based training. And again, I think the manufacturers, the technological companies have kind of jumped on that term and marketed it and made it what it is today. And I think that's both a really good thing, but can be a little bit of a hindrance as well. Because for me, velocity-based training is basically any form of training that utilizes the measurement of velocity. So when we talk about the measurement of velocity, basically we're talking about generally we talk about the measurement of barbell velocity over a concentric phase of an exercise or a lift. And the main two types of velocities that we would measure is mean, so that's the mean velocity across the concentric phase, or peak velocity, which is kind of that instantaneous peak in velocity over that same phase, so that concentric phase. So for me, VBT is actually a bit more of an umbrella term. It's not really a type of training because it covers so many different things. It's very difficult to really determine what a VBT program is because it's quite a generalized term. So for me, you kind of got a number of different things that fall under this term of velocity-based training. You've got load velocity profiling. You've got the use of velocity to manipulate load on a sessional or set-by-set basis. You've also got the use of velocity to help regulate fatigue through this idea of velocity loss. And I think you can also stretch it as far as kind of using it as a bit more of a qualitative motivational tool to build that kind of healthy competitive environment within a training setting. And essentially, VBT or the measurement of velocity is based on the principle of the load velocity relationship, which is analogous to the force velocity relationship, which was theorized, right at the start of the 1900s. And it's very, very simply, it's the relationship between load and velocity, which seems to be inverse and linear, or maybe slightly curvilinear. And that, again, well, just like the force velocity relationship, is based on the cross-bridge cycling and the interaction between actin and myosin, and how those interactions will reduce as the speed or the velocity of a movement increases. A lot of the earlier research sort of towards the start of this decade that's just gone, from different Spanish researchers, primarily has showed some really, really strong relationships between load and velocity, which has enabled researchers like myself to really take hold of that idea and see how far we can get with it. So I think, VBT it's very much an intern, but I think it can be quite confusing, certainly for those maybe not in the area. And I think you can look at it from many different angles and different facets.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a few different ways of using it, and that's my next question, is because I imagine most people out there understand, velocity-based training as measuring the speed of movement for power exercises, for developing power. So could you go into a bit more detail on what the other ways of using VBT are, whether it's predicting 1RMs or auto-regulation of training, things like that?
Yeah, of course. I think you hit the nail on the head a little bit there, in the sense that VBT has always been thought of as this tool for developing power. And if we define power as kind of that typical final block of training prior to competition, or the sessions that you might have on a weekly basis, if we're talking more team sports, that really try to utilize those faster velocity, explosive, ballistic type exercises. I suppose you kind of your thoughts or your mindset automatically goes to power training, VBT going hand in hand. But again, that's quite misleading, because the application of velocity during training can be done across any type of training, any block of training, and actually with many different types of athletes. And I remember seeing on Twitter not too long ago, maybe last year, talking about how there almost need to be prerequisites before utilizing VBT. So a little bit like you need to have certain strength levels to really utilize and maximize plyometric training, for example. There was the thought process that it was similar to utilizing VBT, but I don't necessarily agree with that. And I think the four main approaches that I mentioned earlier are the key to velocity-based training. So I like to think about kind of an S&C's coach's role, certainly from a prescriptive basis, three different main aspects. You've got the testing and the monitoring, you've got the load prescription, and then you've got that regulation of fatigue and volume. And within those three areas, you can sort of slip in velocity-based training or the measurement of velocity quite nicely. So you've got, with the testing and the monitoring, you can start to develop a load velocity profile, which is, again, very simply, is pretty much a 1RM. It's an incremental test, a heavy or the heaviest load that somebody can lift in sensible increments. So that could be 10%, could be 5%, could be 20%, dependent on time, logistics, number of athletes that you've got to profile, etc. And then you can utilize the measurement of velocity from that profile in many different ways. And I think one of the most potential sort of exciting ways to use it is through this manipulation of load. And I think in order to really understand how it works, I think kind of the critiquing current methods is quite important. So, currently we would prescribe load through undertaking a 1RM and then prescribing percentages of that 1RM, or potentially a repetition maximum in terms of rep ranges, throughout a 4, 6, 8, 12-week intervention, and then we probably retest. Now, what that doesn't do, or what that struggles to do, is take into account the everyday changes in strength and fatigue. So if we take a rugby player, for example, they've got technical training, they've got travel, they've got sleep, they've got nutrition, they've got maybe supplements, they've got lots of sort of confounding extraneous variables that might affect their ability to step into a gym and really hit their maximums on a consistent basis. And then coupled with that, you've got the fact that athletes will get stronger if you put together a really clear and appropriate intervention. An athlete is going to get stronger, and it's not going to happen right at the end of that 6 weeks. It's going to happen gradually throughout. So if you're still utilizing the the initial baseline 1RM, then prescribing loads that account to an 85% 1RM are going to start to be less effective because they're not hitting that right kind of stress. And your strength levels will change, therefore the knock-on effect to all the relative loads will change as well. And that's going to have a knock-on effect to the adaptation that might be elicited, and might kind of come out within your athletes. So the idea of kind of manipulating load through velocity is to target a velocity as opposed to target a load. So if we know for someone's 85% that their velocity is 0.6, for example, then instead of targeting absolute load on the bar, we can say, well, we want you to work at 0.6 for this particular lift, for this particular day, and we're going to make sure that the absolute load, so the kilograms on the bar, matches that 0.6 meters per second if we're talking mean velocity. And that, I think, provides a real flexibility and a real sort of reactiveness to all these different extraneous variables that I've mentioned, and allows coaches and athletes to really be in tune with the bodies and hopefully optimize prescription on a regular basis. And I think, sorry, it's been quite a long answer, but I think the final sort of area or direction you can take velocity, which is maybe a little bit more simple than the other two methods, is this idea of volume control and fatigue management. And a simple method to do that would be defining a velocity loss or a velocity cutoff. So let's say, for example, you want to focus more on strength developments than hypertrophy. You might decide to work at a 10% or a 20% cutoff in velocity. What I mean by that is, from the start of the set, as long as those repetitions are the velocity and the effort and the intent are maximized for each repetition, instead of saying or instead of prescribing a set of 6, you'll simply prescribe a volume of 20% cutoff in velocity. And again, the theory behind this is that it should be in tune with the kind of how your neuromuscular system's feeling, and allows you to regulate volume and regulate fatigue a little bit more effectively, and hopefully a little bit more accurately, and allow for a better training environment and hopefully more appropriate adaptations.
Yeah, it's brilliant stuff. Very, very well explained. Aside from the fact of improving the kind of training through using velocity, you've got those logistical issues in rugby and other team sports where testing is quite difficult to do in season, and also like having performed programs where you're doing the same exercise every day. What you notice from that is that some days you perform amazingly, and on other days when you expect to perform well, you don't. So it just shows those day-to-day rhythms in your body that they're unpredictable and hard to measure. Whereas if you've got a velocity measure, it just adapts the program on the fly rather than kind of just sort of guessing a rep range or a load. So it's really interesting stuff. Now you mentioned mean velocity and peak velocity. What are the sort of benefits of either or why would you use one over the other? And are there any things looking at kind of rate of force development? Any of the new bits of technology actually measure that? Because obviously that's something that's important to develop as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the two different types of velocity, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and sort of say that I'm not a fan of peak velocity. So some of the research that I've done through the university as part of my PhD has found that peak velocity isn't as reliable as potentially mean velocity is. And even so, traditionally or when kind of velocity-based training really became popular, there was the thought process that mean velocity should be preferred for strength-based exercises because you're looking at the velocity across a full concentric phase, and it gives you a real picture around what that athlete is capable of. Are they a grinder, for example? Can they get the heavy loads, and can they really move that nice and slowly and still successfully complete the lift? Or are they someone that's a lot sort of twitchier? Do they have a more reactive ballistic makeup, and therefore they're never going to be hitting those real slow velocities because they just bottom out. And therefore peak velocity was aimed more at the your power training, as we've already discussed, so plyometrics, Olympic lifting, etc., etc. But I find peak velocity, because it's that one instantaneous moment of velocity, if your athletes are not consistent, then you can get these odd sort of spikes, and that concerns me a little bit, no matter what the exercise is. So from a personal perspective, I'm kind of not saying that people shouldn't use peak velocity, but from a personal perspective, I would probably 9 times out of 10 I would focus on mean velocity, whatever the exercise is that we're prescribing, and that, I think, again is maybe a reason for VBT being appropriate across a whole greater spectrum than just for its kind of power training. And then in terms of rate of force development, from my understanding of the technology that's out there, it's something that potentially might be coming, but there's not really any devices that measure that, and I think it would be difficult to do so, because rate of force development in the way that it needs to be calculated properly is quite unreliable, and there's quite a lot of research out there that shows that measuring rate of force development across many different kind of statistical ways is quite unreliable, and adding kind of to the mix ballistic exercises or movements that non-isometric exercises, I wonder how accurate that measure of rate of force development would be from a barbell linear position transducer, or from a piece of wearable technology like an IMU, for example. So I'm not aware of any, and I would be surprised if any companies really go down that route. But you never know; it might happen.
Yeah. Okay, and going back to what you were saying about, obviously, some people are grinders, or some people are more fast twitch. Are there any good ways using VBT to kind of ascertain a fiber type makeup of a player?
Good question. I think yes and no. I would suggest that you could probably well, it might be more of a psychological aspect, really, in terms of grinders. I think I've have been able to grind out heavy squats at 0.1 meters per second, which is it honestly looks like they're stuck in that sticking point for about 3 minutes, and it looks disgusting, but they managed to get through it. Whether that would really transfer across to someone's fiber type makeup, I would be skeptical, but I think what it does do is it provides you with a real indication as to how far you can push somebody, and maybe helps you tailor the training a little bit. So, if you think you have an athlete who you think could be a lot stronger than they are, and potentially they are bottoming out at some really quite high velocities, then that might provide you with a picture to sort of emphasize heavier training, and even not necessarily slower training, because I wouldn't want to encourage my athletes to move particularly slow. But I think just focusing some time towards those heavier, more grindy reps would help from a physiological adaptation perspective, but from that psychological perspective of being able to do that. We've all been there where we're looking at a load on a bar and we think, I don't know if I've got this, and it's only until you get at the bottom of that squat, or whatever it might be, and start to move through, whether you can do it or not. So I think potentially there's that aspect from a psychological perspective that you could utilise it for. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And like I say, it might be an indicator that they might need to do more, being able to maintain tension in those lifts. Like for example, if you've got a prop, that's part of their game, being able to maintain tension in that sort of position. So it might be you direct their training more down towards that stuff before doing explosive stuff. So it's just another way of getting information about your players, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we kind of touched on the kind of logistics of club and rugby environments. How are teams and clubs applying VBT to their programs?
So I think from my experience, there is a massive spectrum of kind of implementation across different teams and clubs, and I think, to be honest, probably those that utilise it the best, and this might be because of the resource, the logistics, and the amount of staff that they have at kind of your university. Your American colleges, they really know how to utilise VBT and how to implement it properly. But I think if we're talking kind of UK teams, the majority of teams that I'm aware of that utilise VBT, so we're maybe talking more football than we are rugby, because that's kind of where my experiences lie at the moment, is very quite simply. So it might be to take some normative data. So it might be to take some zones, or I'm sure most of your listeners will have seen the different zones, max strength, speed strength, and speed, and the corresponding velocity zones that sort of set to them that some of these technology companies have put together. I think they're okay, and I think a lot of teams will use that because it's quick and it's easy. My concern with that, and I would always advise that if teams and coaches have the time and the resource to be able to do so, that you either create your own individual zones for your own athletes, or you, at the very least, create a club or a positional zone or sort of profile that has those corresponding zones for your athletes. I think, again, from my own research that I've put together, we've found that the load velocity profile itself is very, very individual. We've had at certainly the heavier loads, we've had variation between like-minded, participants with a very similar background. So strength trained to a certain level, competitive weightlifters to a regional level. We found that there was variation of around 20 to 30% in the velocities at specific relative loads. So for example, at 90% 1RM in a back squat, there might have been 20-30% difference in the velocities that these athletes these participants were putting out. And I think that, to me, shows that where possible, we really need to be encouraged creating their own profiles, creating whether that is on an individual basis, but that obviously takes a lot of time, or on a more team basis. And interestingly, there was a piece of research that come out probably the back end of last year from a good friend of mine over at University of Lincoln, who actually showed he's comparing individual versus group-based zones. I tell a lie, it's not out yet. It is coming out though, I think very shortly. And he actually found that there was not an awful lot of difference, which is quite promising, I think, for coaches and organizations and teams that don't have the time to really set individualized zones and individualized profiles, that maybe you can take a few players, profile them, create the zones from that way, and then utilize that across the whole team. So I think that's probably the most common way in which certainly UK based clubs are using velocity to kind of use those zones that have already been described. But I think certainly a very common or effective approach that should be utilized is simply from an athlete buy-in and this idea of developing a competitive, healthy environment. So, I know of some clubs that are basically creating leaderboards, and asking the players to start to chase the speeds instead of chasing the loads. Now, I'm sure in rugby that might not be too big of an issue, because the majority of rugby players, they love being in the gym, they love chasing heavy loads, and they love getting underneath a bar. But in other sports, I've found that that's obviously not always the case. And by giving them velocity targets and getting them to move faster, and not necessarily worry about the load that's on the bar, or at least, as we've already mentioned, use that velocity to auto-regulate. So give them a target and let them figure out what should be on the bar to hit that particular zone or that particular velocity target. I found, and I've been told from other coaches at different clubs, that it can be very, very effective, and the athletes come in and they're quite excited to get on the leaderboard and chase some of those velocities. I think all that needs to be done safely, and it needs to be done effectively. It's not necessarily a case of just chucking a device on a bar or on a human and saying, right, go and move something as quick as you possibly can. I think there needs to be some prerequisites in terms of competency and training age to be able to do that safely. But if they're in the right club setting, then I think that shouldn't be really an issue. And just to give you a little example that I've used in the past. So as I mentioned, myself and another member of staff at Hallam University, we work with the City of Sheffield Diving on a regular basis. And we essentially, what we do before the start of every gym session is we will give them a wearable device, and we will stick either a 20k bar on the back, or maybe even just a light wooden dowel, and we'll get them to do a couple of sets of 5 counter movement jumps, and we'll measure the speed, we'll measure the velocity, and we can then use that to track improvements. We can then use that to track if anyone is a bit broken and we have some real drop-offs. But again, importantly, and it was really nice to see, was that the athletes then started to chase it, and it actually became a bit more of a training stimulus, because they wanted the faster velocities, they wanted to jump higher, and it created a really nice environment for them to work in and bounce off each other. And I think there's some real benefit and some real sort of bang for your buck in implementing this type of training within those kind of environments. It's simple, it's easy, and it can be really effective. Jamie, you're there? I lost you.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, my experience of athletes are competitive by nature. So if you can make the training competitive, you tend to get a lot more out of them, and even to the point where I've gone away in some cases of doing more individual loads for jump squats, for example. I just get the similar groups of players on the same weight, so they're competing for the velocity as opposed to having different weights and just competing with themselves. They love it. It just builds a really good atmosphere. I think your answer also touched on, like you said, it's got to be in the right environment where they've got a good training history and good technique. So my next question would be kind of a negative note, I guess. Are there any limitations to velocity-based training?
Yeah, I like to think of it more of maybe considerations than limitations, but I think yeah, of course there are. Like any approach to anything that we do as S&C coaches, there's always considerations and limitations, and I think there are a few key ones that I certainly want to pick up on here. From a logistical perspective, the initial hope from VBT was that it would take away the need to 1RM test, and it would really become very time efficient for big clubs. Now, for me, the research doesn't really work in favour of that. So in order to do a load velocity profile, we kind of need a decent number of increments, or a decent number of loads to really get a clear and an accurate profile that we can utilize. And I know you mentioned earlier about 1RM predictions, and unfortunately, at the moment, the research isn't great around 1RM prediction. So that idea of being able to step into a gym, do a few lifts at some different speeds, plot the kind of the profile, plot the regression equation, and predict your 1RM, and then work backwards to readjust loads, maybe doesn't work in that respect. There are definite ways in which we can manipulate load like that, but that would require a full profile and working up to 1RM, right. Which maybe does take away some of that initial time efficiency of VBT. I think a couple of other things related to the profile itself is, we've already mentioned that ideally it's an individualized relationship. So again, that could add to the time, and there is some research, including my own, that has shown that those very, very heavy loads, so 1RM, the reliability of velocity up there isn't great as well. Now that could be because, if you're moving somebody's moving a bar at 0.2 meters per second, then if they then move it at 0.22, well, that's a 10% difference. So from a statistical perspective, that looks massive, but actually it's 0.02 of a meter per second, and I'd be very happy if I had that kind of levels of consistency. So sometimes the research maybe doesn't quite ring true from a statistical perspective as to what's happening right up at those heavy loads. But I think there is also this notion of, if you have a grinder and you have a competent lifter, that when you get up to 1RM, the technique and the thought process behind that lift kind of goes out the window, and it's a case of, I'm going to get this bar up in whatever way possible. So if that changes some of the the kinematics of the movement on the descent, that's going to have a knock-on effect to some of the body positioning on the ascent, and that could affect obviously velocity. So it's bearing in mind some of those reliability issues at those heavier loads. And I think then the final thing is it's very specific. So unfortunately, there's no real transference across devices. So if you have a GymAware, for example, and then you want to then acquire a push, the data doesn't really transfer across from one to the other. So if you're going to utilize VBT, do some research on the device that you want to use, and then stick to that device. I think that's really important, that you stick to the same device. And then the final thing is that the profile itself, the relationship between load and velocity, is very much exercise specific as well. So if you're providing zones for a deadlift, those zones are not going to transfer across to a back squat. So from that perspective, it's a case of maybe only utilizing VBT for the really important key lifts. Likelihood is that would be a back squat, that might be a deadlift, it might be a bench press, it might be an Olympic lift. And I think making sure how you can profile and how you can then implement VBT into your training is really, really important, because there's absolutely no point in profiling a bicep curl. We don't need to know how fast we can do that. They're the auxiliary exercises that complement our training, but where VBT could be important, it could be effective, is those key lifts. So I think it's a case of really having clear the rationale for implementing VBT and the exercises that you want to implement it with.
Yeah, I think you're right. And going back to what you're saying about the different clubs sort of need to develop their own kind of profiles and velocity sort of targets for different exercises. And what you mentioned there is that my experience of different rugby clubs, they all squat differently. Some will box squat, some will free squat, some will squat to a lot higher range. So to use the same velocity measure, when you know that it's going to be a different squatting technique, you need to adapt it to your environment. So there's all good points there. And you mentioned a few devices there, and that's my next question: is what are the options for your amateur rugby players and athletes to incorporate VBT into their training?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of devices, there's probably 50 plus on the market, if not more now. It's really taken off. And there are obviously some really good ones, and there are obviously some not so good ones. And I try not to sort of hang my hat on any. I try to be a sort of a researcher that is unbiased. But in terms of the types of technology that's out there, you've got linear position transducers, which is kind of your gym aware type device. You've got inertial measurements units, which IMUs, which are kind of your wearable technologies like push and push and beast sensor, for example. And you have camera systems, which are often a little bit more expensive, but very effective because there's no need to attach to a bar or attach to the human. They can be set up and you can do whatever you need to. And we've also got iPhone applications now, and actually there are some really good iPhone apps. Obviously smartphone technology is so advanced nowadays that you can do some really great stuff, some really good tracking of barbells, and get some really good measurements out of a £9.99 app, for example. And I think the fact that there are so many devices out there is again a help, but also a hindrance, because it's very difficult to kind of decipher through all that noise of which is the best device to go for. So I think if you have access to it, if you're looking to buy a device, please jump on some of the research first, look at the reliability, look at the data, make sure that what you're getting is appropriate. Obviously assess the practicalities, obviously assess the logistics, the cost, all associated with these devices, and then make an informed decision. Ask for some advice, find people on social media that are using the devices and get their opinions as well. But I think in terms of the kind of the average gym goer or the average athlete that wants to maybe get a little bit more out of the training, maybe try something different, I think utilizing velocity-based training in its simplest form can be very effective. And it's kind of going back to this idea of just setting a simple target. So, if we take kind of one of the simplest or most common laws of physics, which is Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. And if we assume that in order for someone to be stronger, they need to be able to increase the amount of force that they can produce. So in order to do that, from that equation, we have to change two things, or one of two things. We need to increase the mass, which would be the load on the bar, or we need to increase the acceleration, or the speed at which we move something or can move something across a time point. So if we provide, or if an athlete then wants to provide some simple targets, they could essentially just simply look to see if they can move the same mass faster. So you put together a training intervention, start and end, could be 100k. If you can move that faster at the end, then we can probably suggest that something has been effective and you've got stronger. Or similarly, if you can move a heavier mass at the same speed, same velocity, same acceleration.
Yeah, definitely. I think
it's very simple, but again, it's very, very.
Sorry, you still there?
Yeah, still got. Yeah. Sorry, I think
that's all right. Yeah, Wi-Fi's a bit dodgy. No, yeah, great point, and I think it just highlights. I'd imagine a lot of trainers would be just trying to increase the load. So it's highlighting the importance that increase the velocity as well. Over time, you want to increase both, so you're lifting heavier weight and you're doing it faster. That's the kind of the long-term goal. So it's a great point. Now, where do you see? Obviously, you're doing research yourself, so this would be really interesting to see where do you see the practice of VBT going and or changing, and what are the sort of things that you want to look at moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, and I think this is probably common consensus here, that we simply don't know enough about VBT. It's kind of come from this traditional reverse approach that seems to happen in strength and conditioning, that something will be done in practice for quite a long time, and then it'll somehow trickle its way into the research to see how effective it really is. And I think that research is now trying to, and it still needs to catch up with what's happening in practice. So I think over the next 3, 4, 5 years, I think simply we just need to learn more about it. What's effective, what's not effective, and how can we improve and perfect some of these approaches that I mentioned. I think we probably need to look at a better way to profile. So I've kind of mentioned some of those pitfalls around logistics, time consumption, and that kind of thing. I think we really need to try and develop a reliable and a robust method, but that isn't as time consuming as undertaking a 1RM. And hopefully that could incorporate that 1RM prediction that unfortunately at the moment isn't quite there in the research. I think a really important focus in the research would be to look at the stability of the profile over the course, sort of longitudinally. So if we are adjusting somebody's strength, maximal strength over the course of a season, let's say every 6 weeks their strength increases by 10 to 15%, dependent on what kind of training they're doing, and we readjust the absolute loads to the relative loads, do the velocities at those relative loads, do they remain stable or do they change with training as well? And we don't really know that. And I think if we do know that, that'll allow us to determine how often we then need to profile. And if we can get away with profiling someone the start of the season and then, let's say, Christmas time, then actually that profile becomes a lot more usable and easier to implement within these time-consuming environments. But until we know that, it's difficult to make those assumptions. So it's kind of, we're still reliant on every 6 weeks when we would 1RM, well, that's low velocity profile, because we're not quite sure how stable that is. And then I think finally we need to do more intervention studies. To date, there is only 3 that I'm aware of that have done a true velocity-based loading or velocity-based training intervention that have utilized it in the ways that I've kind of described it previously. And that's obviously that's where I'm going to end up with my PhD, is to put together hopefully a very practically applied and robust training intervention that utilizes VBT, compare that against a more traditional percentage-based intervention, and we'll see what happens, see where the differences lie there between the two. I don't think there's going to be massive differences. I don't think you're going to suddenly get an extra 20% on your squat from VBT, but I think what it might do is it might help you to refine the way that you control volume and hopefully look at how can we improve strength the same amount but by doing less volume, which I think would be very, very advantageous to many team sports out there, being able to do something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That'll be really interesting, and look forward to hearing about that when you do it. So next question we ask all the guests on the podcast. So feel free to draw from all your knowledge, obviously not just rugby players, but what do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
Your perspective, if that's all right, sort of thinking athletes and coaches. And I'm going to stay on kind of the trend of VBT, because I think currently one of the biggest issues, and I think this has come from the marketing and of the devices and the way that they've been promoted, is that S&C coaches seem to feel like VBT is this holy grail of provision. It's the one tool that everybody needs, and it's the only thing that we need. And that's just not it. That can't be the case. It's like anything. It's an additional tool. It's a way to monitor, track, manipulate, but we still shouldn't be forgetting the other approaches. So, very simple example. I'm not suggesting that a low velocity profile should completely replace the 1RM test, because the 1RM test has been established for years and is very reliable and is very appropriate. But what the low velocity profile can and potentially should do is complement it. So the earlier stages of a 1RM, simply stick on a device, track the velocity of those lighter loads, and then build that profile. So I think, and I suppose it's not just VBT, but I think it's from a coaching perspective, it's making sure that you have lots of different tools that you can really play on and really implement. And I suppose from a player's perspective as well, it's being open to suggestions, being open to new things, new approaches, and trying different things, because there's probably something out there that you haven't tried that could be really, really effective for you personally. And I think that's really important to try and keep that open mind when it comes to strength and conditioning, and try new and different things wherever possible to really build a picture on what's effective and what isn't.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we'll try and get you away from the velocity-based training discussion now, and just pull on your experience from practical and your academic background, and what is or what do you think some of the other interesting research that's coming out around strength and conditioning?
Yeah, so doing a PhD in velocity-based training is kind of does focus your reading to that particular area. But recently I was asked to write a sort of a small article for a new journal that's coming out based in the UK. It's the International University Strength and Conditioning Association, and they're producing a journal. And I was contacted by the editor, and they asked me to write a bridging the gap kind of article, looking at how can we better allow researchers and practitioners to collaborate and bridge that gap between sort of research and practice. And as I was writing that, I was kind of looking at maybe the journey of some of the S&C research across the past 20 years or whatever. And it was really nice to see that a lot of the research has started to really try to become practically applied, and I think that's really important. So you've got additional sections now in research that have practical applications, where the researchers try to communicate and disseminate their findings for a way in which the coach can utilize. But on the flip side of that, the research process is still very, very traditional, and it takes a lot of time, and there are certain boxes that need to be ticked in order to get a piece of research published. And I think that does really provide this gap between research and practice, and prevents the real application of the research in an applied setting. And when I was writing this article, I was starting to kind of read around this idea of developing case studies, and it's something that I think a lot of journals are going to start to move towards. And I think it's something that can be really utilized, because it can allow for some strong collaborations. You can sort of implement a researcher into a training environment. They can help with the robustness and reliability of the data that's being collected, but that data doesn't have to sort of meet as many criteria as it would do if it was a piece of primary research, the traditional journal article, if you will. So I think for me, the development of case study articles and research is quite exciting, and I think can be really, really, really effective moving forwards, that are really trying to utilize the research, but maybe are struggling a little bit. I know from the times that I've coached, certainly before I really got into research, I found it very difficult to translate the research into practice, because you've got so many different moving parts. It's so multifaceted is applied practice, that the research just often doesn't fit in there. Whereas I think case studies can be really really useful, and can be a really effective method of, as I've mentioned, sort of bridging that gap. So I think for me that's kind of a really interesting development in S&C. I think probably one of the other one that I'd maybe mention is I've been lucky enough to sort of spend a bit of time and collaborate with a member of staff at the University of Chichester called Jason Lake, and I've seen him speak a couple of times, and he talks about the utilization of force plate data, and the way he kind of talks about it and implements it is quite different. So it's utilizing data that you can get from a force plate to actually paint a picture of how somebody moves and how somebody jumps, if we're going to use that as an example. So it's not just looking at jump height and force. you might look at range of motion, you might look at impulse, you might look at a number of different metrics that helps to build a picture of how that athlete actually works and moves, and provides a coach with some really key information that could then help tailor training effectively. So it's not just a case of we want them to jump higher. We now need to utilize strategy, the way in which they perform a task, and implement that into training and into coaching. And I think that's really cool for me as a bit of a geek when it comes to this kind of thing. That to me is really interesting. It might not be to many S&C coaches out there, but I think that's quite a cool way of looking at utilizing force plate data.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff, and definitely the case studies are always stuff that I've found very valuable from the research side of it, but also a kind of snapshot and a look at what other people are doing from the practical side of it. So that's great stuff. What next question? What advice would you give to an upcoming strength coach, and are there any books or resources you'd recommend?
So in terms of advice, I suppose I get that question quite a lot. Being the course leader of an MSc in strength and conditioning, I deal with a lot of students that have decided they want to undertake a career in strength and conditioning, and often ask, what's your advice? What's the best approach? And I think for me, it's a case of developing a passion, immersing yourself in an environment, trying things out, trying to get your head in the research and understand S&C approaches and as much as you possibly can. I think finding a mentor is really, really important, and being able to spend time with people that are established, that are really effective in strength and conditioning is so key as well. So I think really, really importantly and often forgotten in S&C is the fact that we are coaches, and that strength and conditioning coaching is somewhat of an art. And I think if you can't coach, and this is going to sound very cliche, but if you can't coach, then you can write the best program in the world, but it's never going to be effective. So I think actually, yes, spend time perfecting your ability to prescribe and to test and collect good data, but also don't neglect the fact that coaching is relationship building. It's building trust. It's being able to communicate. It's being able to be in an environment with lots of different people and feel comfortable and get those people ticking off one another or maybe off themselves. And I think in terms of that advice would be think a little bit wider as well than just elite sport. So on our masters, we try to encourage our students to think more sort of left field, if you will. So think about the public sector, S&C in the public sector for the elderly, for lifestyle diseases, for youth obesity, for example. And there's an emerging area here where public sector companies and organisations are crying out for S&C coaches, but a lot of up-and-coming S&C coaches are so hell-bent on getting into elite sport, which I think is brilliant, and I don't criticise that at all. But I think just having an open mind on the different directions that you can take with S&C is really, really important, and can really open the door to careers for coaches. And then finally, in terms of books, again, I'm going to go a little bit different, and I'm actually going to, I think for me, listening to podcasts like this and other podcasts that are out there, reading blog posts and talking to practitioners is so much more effective than sticking your head in, the essentials of strength training and conditioning. So I would always encourage that up-and-coming coaches listen to podcasts just like this one, and start to build networks with practitioners and try and have conversations as opposed to just getting bogged down by the theory and the principles. It's interesting that when I was writing my the article on Bridging the Gap, I came across a paper that actually found that they interviewed 320 different S&C coaches and found that 1.8% of the information and their development came from journal articles, whereas 41% came from simply talking and conversations with other practitioners. And I think that's quite powerful, to maybe move away from that traditional way of learning and gaining knowledge and information, and maybe start to think a little bit more contemporary, like I mentioned, with podcasts just like this one.
Yeah, definitely great advice. And going back to your earlier answers, it's a common theme from the guests we have on. It's those soft skills of coaching and relationship building, developing buy-in for your players and squad. They're so important. And like you say, without those, you can have the best program in the world, but it won't get up and running without that. So some great advice there. Lastly, Steve, where can people learn more about you?
So I'm on social media. I'll hold my hands up and say I'm not the best, but I am on social media. So probably the best place to catch me is on Twitter. My handle's Steve381. Always happy to sort of link up with like-minded people, have conversations. I'll always reply to any messages that get sent my way. And such is life at the moment. I seem to be spending a lot of my time on Skypes and Zooms and stuff, so more than happy to jump on something like that with anybody that's interested. So yeah, I'd say Twitter's probably the best option.
Awesome, and we'll share links to your Twitter account in the show notes. But lastly, Steve, thank you for coming and talking about this. Obviously, VBT is a very in topic at the moment, and it's great to have some of your experience with it to kind of give us the information about it. And I know you were down to speak more about it at our conference, which unfortunately we've had to postpone because of COVID. But we're hoping when we get the date for 2021, you'll be able to stay involved, and it'd be great for people to kind of pick your brains more about the topic.
Absolutely, yeah. Count me in for that. Definitely still keen to be involved in that conference. It's a really great thing that you're doing. So yeah, count me in, and it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for having me on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers, Jamie.
So there you have it. Hopefully everything you need to know about velocity-based training. Thanks, Steve, for coming on the podcast and talking to us about it. Some tons of great information there. Much appreciated, and all the best for the future. In the meantime, guys, please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, Tuners, Spotify, whatever you use for podcasts, and of course give us a 5-star review, and keep checking us out on the social media channels and of course rugbyrenegade.com.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.